And where are the floors? There's 110 floors in each of these towers. We're looking for 110 floors somewhat stacked up on the bottom, as we see on the right in a real gravitational or pancaking collapse. On the left, we see a 2-3-story pile, maybe 4, of core columns, perimeter columns, etc. Where's the 110 floors? We'd be looking for that. They seem to be missing. As we look at key feature number 8, these enormous pulverized clouds of concrete, missing concrete at the bottom. 90,000 tons of concrete isn't stacked up in mangled form at the bottom, but pulverized in mid-air. How does it get pulverized in mid-air? Not at the bottom where it develops its gravitational potential energy, but in mid-air and laying out like a blanket across lower Manhattan in a 3-square-mile area from river to river. What's in this dust? We have up to 30% of it being concrete, as documented by the U.S. Geological Survey. Let's listen to the governor.
So, Mr. Gage?
There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum and steel.
What happened to the concrete?
The concrete was pulverized. And I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All of lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust and powder 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
So, Mr. Gage, we have a question from Judge Impasamato, I think.
110-story.
You can ask a quick question.
You don't find a desk. You don't find a chair. You don't find a telephone, a computer. The biggest...
Judge, would you start over, please? I didn't hear the first part of that question.
Can I ask? Should be possible a scientific judicial experiment foreseen by several criminal codes in order to assess the possibility that the fall of World Trade Center 7 could have happened in the way indicated by NIST. It is possible to reproduce a situation, in fact, using buildings that must be destroyed in order to assess, because in penal code, we use often as a proof the experiment judicial in order to assess the possibility that a building fell in the way affirmed by NIST or in the way affirmed by David Chandler or by you. So I ask, it should be possible to make an experiment judicial reproducing the similar situation in order to assess this fact.
Yes, there's 100 experiments that have been done. They're called controlled demolitions. They're done every week somewhere in the world, and they collapse nearly free fall symmetrically into their own footprints typically. And so that's the level, that's the experiment that we can compare the Building 7 to directly. So yes, that's how I would answer that question.
So, Mr. Gage, if I might just follow up, I think what the judge wants to know, although I understand your answer that that data is available from real-life experiments, but it is an interesting question. Do you think it would be feasible for, in a litigation, say a civil litigation that might be brought in the future, to construct an experiment for the benefit of the court to demonstrate these facts? Do you have any feeling for the feasibility and what the cost might be to do such a demonstration?
It seems to be outrageous. I couldn't afford it.
Appreciate that.
Okay, thank you. The NFPA 921, the Guide for Fire and Explosion, also investigations also suggest that we look at thermal effects. What are the thermal effects? Well, large volumes of gas and the large amount of heat released from rapidly expanding plumes, as we saw in World Trade Center Building 7. We'll be looking at also evidence of such in the World Trade Center Twin Towers, and as we see, it is indeed abundant. Thick plumes, in this case following freely flying structural steel sections, curiously enough, but also in every direction away from the Twin Towers. this massive heat, much more heat than the few spires that we saw available at the time of the collapse of these buildings. Where is all this heat coming from, creating these rapidly expanding plumes? Well, indeed, it's documented also by Bechtel, 2,800 degree temperatures. This is a huge increase in heat, well above that available from the office fires, 500 to 1,000 degrees. NIST claims maybe 1,800 degrees. Well, they do claim that, but they have no evidence to suggest it. But that can't even account for a river of steel flowing, as documented by Leslie Robertson, the World Trade Center structural engineer himself, and his associate, Richard Garlock. The debris past the columns was red hot, molten, running. Red hot steel being pulled from deep within the pile. Pools of literally molten steel, says the president of the cleanup company, dripping from the molten steel, seeing the molten steel, uncovering red hot metal beams. As we see, pouring out of the South Tower, molten iron, as it turns out, that you'll see, minutes prior to its collapse. Where is this thick, high temperature indicated by the yellow and white hot material? Well, NIST says this must be melted airplane. Well, melted airplane looks like aluminum flowing. It doesn't glow bright yellow in the daylight conditions. Keith Eaton says, ranging from molten metal, which was still red hot weeks after the event. Molten steel at the heart of the tower's remains. Molten steel beams, says this sanitation spokesman. Streams of molten metal leaked from the hot cores and flowed down. Metal dripping from the beam, and you can see photographs as well here, dripping from the crab claw holding the material in this excavator, liquid molten, falling, dripping from the molten steel. Steel members in the debris pile, partially evaporated, says the author of the FEMA report that documented the metallurgical analysis seen in the FEMA report. Partly evaporated. It takes 4,000 degree temperatures to evaporate steel. Where did that temperature come from? Concrete was melted, flowing like lava. It takes 3,200 degrees to melt concrete. Where does that heat come from? Molten steel encountered primarily during the excavation of debris. Videotape of molten steel being dipped out of buckets of the excavators.
One of the more unusual artifacts to emerge from the rubble is this rock-like object that has come to be known as the meteorite.
It's this fused element of steel, molten steel and concrete and all of these things all fused by the heat.
And architects, engineers, people who work with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in our lives.
Yet NIST and its lead engineer, John Gross, have this to say about all of this material.
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah.
Like lava.
From a volcano.
Actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall.
And the cleanup was very difficult in the beginning. Steel was coming out red in certain areas from the first couple of weeks.
This fused element of steel, molten steel.
And they pulled out the big block of concrete, and there was like a little river of steel flowing.
Well, here's John Gross on the pile, cutting out off the beam the piece of steel that was actually used for the metallurgical examination in the FEMA report, which he then ejected from the final NIST report as he had authority over that final report. But his shadow seems to be all over the evidence. Thomas Iger, a supporter of the official story, says maybe these fires were 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, structural steel doesn't even melt until 2750. What can produce that? We'll be looking at thermite, an incendiary used by the military to cut through steel like a hot knife through butter, which produces molten iron at 4,500 degree temperatures. But do we have evidence of this molten iron, thermite? And in fact, what is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Fascinating. So now we have a possible source for the massive heat, a possible source for the sulfur, and a possible source for all of this molten iron that we didn't have before. Well, NFPA 921 says look for unusual residues that could result from thermite. NIST acknowledges, after claiming that it found no residues of explosives, acknowledged that it never even looked for them. But others have. In fact, independent scientists have, and we'll be looking at that evidence. First, let's turn once again to John Cole with experiment number 3. Well, number 2.
Right, thank you. Again, one of the claims was that thermite could not cut steel. And so once again, the mainstream media put on a presentation on the National Geographic that said, this is what they said. They said experiment. They showed an experiment where they said thermite could not cut steel. And I had done it in my backyard with a lot less thermite. They used 175 pounds. I used less than 10%. And in fact, I could cut steel with thermite, or actually thermate, which is the thermite with the sulfur in it.
And it works. And this piece of this invention, patented prior to 9/11, uses thermite to cut through steel, cutting in an order of hundreds of milliseconds. It's much more effective at cutting through structural steel than high-energy explosives like RDX that would leave, though, a loud signature, an incredible blast or series of them, as we see in typical controlled demolitions, that would provide a loud, bright, a very bright flash, which may want to have been avoided in a deceptive controlled demolition. In fact, these devices are built, devices similar to them, with consolidated thermite. There's nothing left then behind except pools of molten iron, for which, of course, we've seen much evidence.
Richard, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
What's the connection between the thermate and the explosions? Why would, if explosions can bring down the building, why would thermate be needed? What's the connection between the two?
Well, thermite appears to have been used, and it may have been used as a result of the desire to avoid the loud signatures of high-energy explosives, blast, bright flashes. But there would be all of this extra material left behind, not only in the pools of molten iron that we've seen, but in the powder here, as you see. The USGS, U.S. Geological Survey, and R.J. Lee, an environmental consulting firm, find and document what? Billions of iron microspheres. They are elemental iron, they're round, they're the size of a human hair, they're found in all the World Trade Center dust, very well documented, completely unexplained. But up to 6% of many of these samples are composed of exactly this. So here it is there, but they can't explain it. What can explain it? Molten iron is the byproduct of thermite. But they ignore that and suggest in this signature component, it's not even World Trade Center dust unless it has all of these billions of iron microspheres, elemental iron, not melted steel, that they don't even explain the source of. So, in fact, they are actually a signature marker, is what they say. And it is found in all of this work done by all of these other scientists. And in fact, when thermite is set off, even in a small amount of thermite, what you see here is iron microspheres ejected through the force, forming itself into a sphere. Why? The surface tension of a liquid, when it's aerosolized or dispersed, forms itself into a sphere. So it cools and falls with all of the dust. Could that explain, for instance, the tops of the cars, which are toasted, and the heat from which everybody was fleeing from this hot event?